Okay. Hi, everybody. Hopefully our brains aren't at saturation point yet. Yeah, I'm David Caragliano, and I help with NDI's China programs. So we're conducting activities with local partners to amplify citizen voice. This is something that Kobil mentioned this morning in his talk. And this has made me think a lot about issues relating to online speech. So states employ a number of tools to remove bad speech from the internet. And in the short time we have, I want to focus on real name registration. What I found is that even in authoritarian contexts like China, real name registration often isn't really a viable policy. Okay, so what is real name registration? I define real name registration as systems that require web users to register their real names or identification numbers with online service providers before posting comments. And the justification for real name registration, it's pretty much the same across the board. It's to curb malicious speech. And so what I'd like to do now is sort of briefly touch on each of the cases I've looked at and then explain my conclusions. So, okay, South Korea. I will cut to the chase here. The Korean Supreme Court unanimously struck down the real name registration rule there. And they did that just last August. The court said that the rule infringed freedom of speech. It was actually ineffective at curbing malicious speech. There was inconsistent application of the law, and government and service providers had better alternatives. So a few highlights about the South Korean case. The websites complying with the real name policy became targeted, and 35 million users of one popular social networking site had their personal details stolen. Second thing, to the point that the court made about inconsistent application of the law, certain foreign web platforms refused to comply with the real name system. They simply disabled their video upload and comment functionalities. But by changing their country settings, Korean users were still able to upload and comment on these foreign sites. So from the perspective of Korean service providers, the law really caused them to just incur additional web development, monitoring, security costs, and it really put them at a competitive disadvantage. Okay, China. So it's a little bit soon to really measure the impact of China's real name policy on malicious speech. But if we look closely, we can see that it's been a real challenge to get online service providers like Encina, for example, one of the main microblogging platforms in China, to implement this. So a few quick points here. So Encina has around 500 million individual user accounts, but as of mid-2012, that's just after this rule came into effect, only about 6% of the users were actually registered with verified real names. And so Encina, it's threatened to suspend anonymous users' accounts, and in some cases it's even temporarily blocked certain functions for anonymous users. But in the end, it actually has allowed them to continue to tweet, and it really hasn't followed through on these threats. So the real name law, it hasn't stopped what authorities in China call their sort of online rumor problems. And web users there have continued to use online forums to shine a spotlight on government corruption and scandals. Okay, so Facebook. Yeah, so Facebook is an interesting contrast to the previous two cases because it's a large transnational network. It's obviously not a government, and it's also a NASDAQ-listed public company. So Facebook certainly hasn't been able to eliminate malicious speech, but I think we can conclude that Facebook has been relatively successful at implementing a real name policy. So just one quick point about Facebook. Facebook has gotten some negative press that its adherence to a real name policy has essentially aided and abetted state crackdowns against political activists. Okay, this is my last slide. I want to identify a couple of factors that affect the viability of real name registration. First, the type of social media really matters. So I like to understand different types of social media along a spectrum, with social-driven social media on the one end and content-driven social media on the other. Platforms like Facebook, which are largely social-driven, they're going to have an easier time getting users to comply with real name policies compared with more content-driven platforms like the microblogs that are so popular in China. So this helps explain why Weibo users, they don't care that the information is coming from anonymous sources, and in fact, anonymously generated content is exactly the kind of juicy news and gossip that they're coming online to see. So if we take this one step further, if real name registration were successfully implemented in China, and anonymity was effectively banned on the internet, that would likely degrade content quality, and it would probably drive away users, especially for these sort of microblogs, which are so popular there. Second, and this is pretty clear from those cases, real name registration is incredibly costly to service providers. There's the administrative burden of verifying whether each of those accounts are actually genuine. And then there's costs related to information security. And I mentioned the Korean hacking incidents. Next, we can observe that market share matters. So this kind of played out in an interesting way in China. China has denied market access to foreign media platforms like Twitter, like Facebook. And this has brought about a number of these so-called Chinese clones. And so the market in China is really fragmented, and competition among domestic Chinese providers is intense. So because domestic Chinese service providers know that a decision to weed out anonymous users could negatively affect content and drive away their users, nobody wants to be the first to enforce the policy. And so we have this kind of like prisoner's dilemma paralysis. And so all of this stuff, this all translates to costs and risks. I'm going to skip the last point on governments on social media for now. But I think the takeaway here is that a government seeking to enforce real name registration really has to deliver swift and harsh punishments in order to pull this off. But what are the options that governments really have at their disposal? So in China, for instance, authorities could shut down a platform that's not fully cooperating. But in fact, that may not really be feasible. So it would lead to widespread discontent. It would further fracture the market, which is exactly the opposite of what they want. And it would force governments to deal with new market entrants who may be even less cooperative than the devils that they know. So that's why I think that ultimately, or probably sooner rather than later, governments are going to conclude that real name registration is more trouble than it's really worth. Thanks.